Hi! This time I wanted to recommend some RPG music for your tabletop RPG sessions. It's the soundtrack of Drakkhen. Drakkhen is a very old Super Nintendo and computer game it's available for PC and for the Super Nintendo, but the best one is the Super Nintendo version, mostly because of the music. There's a lot of history when it comes to my how I got to know this about this Super Nintendo game. It's a somewhat hardcore video game experience. I think a lot of people, when it came out and later on, many reviewers were quite harsh on it, but because they do not, I don't think they took too much time in understanding how you play the game and getting drawn into the setting, because it's quite old school. So with this video, I hope I can get you to listen to the soundtrack. I'm going to put a link in the description below to it. It's available here in YouTube because the soundtrack is truly magical. I could basically just tell you, use the soundtrack in your RPG sessions or when you are playing fantasy board games as well. It's a really cool retro style soundtrack. But I also wanted to share with you some nostalgic memories as to why I became so enchanted, so fascinated with the soundtrack. Mm. So I guess everything began with where I was at that moment in my very early teenage years, if I remember correctly. At that time, I didn't have a group to play role-playing games. It was a constant on and off situation. There were some periods where I got to play role-playing games semi-regularly with a group, but it was still around the time of the Christian Panic. A lot of people like to call it the Satanic Panic, when they said that if you played Dungeons and Dragons, you were a Satanist and you worshiped the devil and all of that. But it's mostly the Christian Panic because the Christians were the ones that were pushing that agenda. Satanists were doing their pretty questionable things, but Christians were the ones that were initiating that panic, so I call it the Christian Panic. So it was during this Christian Panic where if you played Dungeons and Dragons, you were a Satanist, you were a cultist, which was pretty ironic considering that Christianity is a cult and they worship a corpse hanging from a stick. So it was quite nonsensical. Either way, it was very difficult because of that. If you played Dungeons and Dragons, you were a Satanist, it had to be approved by the bishop, or it was total chaos. So, very difficult to get a group going. And because of that, I was always looking for some way to enjoy that RPG group experience. We are so fortunate nowadays that if your group doesn't enjoy a certain role-playing game, or you have no group at all, there are so many solo RPGs out there. And you can also take any system and use the different tables, oracles, game master emulators to play your favorite RPG system. I'm going to put a couple of links in the description below to my solo tips playlist, so you can get started with solo RPGs if you have never tried them. And I'm also going to put a link to my Abraham's method that allows you to play any RPG with purchased modules as a game master with emulated player characters. So moving on with the whole dragon thing, I was looking for a video game that had a certain AI system, some sort of artificial intelligence that made you feel as if you were actually playing with a group. I was desperate to play as a member of a party. Being back then, well, nowadays it's still quite difficult, but it was even more difficult back then, a few decades ago, to be a geek that you wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons or Warhammer, etc., etc. Very few places had like hobby centers, hobby stores. It was very difficult to find other players, and the internet was at its infancy. So when it comes to my early teenage years, it was very difficult to find a group. and it was very difficult to find fantasy things as well. Now, the one of the uh, more the shadier aspects of the entire thing is that because different criminal groups here in Mexico, they identified that there were a lot of kids that wanted those fantasy things. They usually created very some fronts, some, what would you say, like fake stores for very questionable things. So, for example, I'm going to keep details a bit ambiguous because, well, you never know if someone else is listening to this, even in current times. But in the place where I was living, there was this store known as, let's call it Desert Comics. And this is not the real name, I'm just using it like a fake name, Desert Comics. So, Desert Comics, it was the only place in the city, in the entire city, where you could find anything related to fantasy and anime, manga, etc. They weren't actually very well stocked, but it was the only thing if you wanted Magic the Gathering to purchase some cards, if you wanted to look for role-playing game books, that was the only place. At least the most popular one, perhaps. Maybe there were like a couple of two smaller places, but it was very difficult to find those places. You needed like to know about them from mouth to mouth. There was no good promotion of them. In fact, there was actually a place where they basically handled things in a very illegal way. Nothing in that case, it was not shady, but they basically took like an abandoned place and turned it into a hobby store. But I don't think they even had the permits for that to carry out their business. But back to Desert Comics. It was a very shady place. They always said that, for example, you arrived during the day and they were announcing these games for Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering. And if you wanted to play, they were always telling you like, yes, we're going to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons or Magic the Gathering, but you have to come tonight. And they tell you something like, oh, and bring some friends. But if you arrived at that time, I didn't go at night, but I had heard of people that if they arrived with their parents and they were like, oh no, there's not going to be any game tonight. But if they arrived alone, they got really like a really creepy feeling. And later on, it was discovered, or rather formally discovered, that it was actually a front for certain things that they do with children. You can imagine what. So yes, it was I don't know about the YouTube censorship. Remember that, check out my channel in Odyssey in case this video gets taken down. But it was basically a place for pornography involving minors. It really displayed a lot of the corruption back then. We still have a lot of, when it comes in terms of corruption, but everybody knew the first time that rumor spread out, it was obvious that it was a front for those sorts of activities, and the authorities did nothing. But then there was another rumor that the owner of that place got into some sort of argument or a fight with one of the members of the authorities, and that's when they decided to move against this place and they shut it down. So there went my only source of fantasy merchandise. It was great that they got them closed, of course. It was a very nasty place. But then I was looking for, where am I going to get my fantasy things? My, books and cards and miniatures and all of that. I hope I am not boring you with this story, but like I said, I could basically just tell you to listen to the soundtrack and that's it. But I really want to give you some background, some information as to why I find this video game so touching, so emotionally charged, and perhaps show you a bit of the life of a geek here in Mexico. So eventually I heard that they were bringing some fantasy stuff to another place, let's call it M Videos, and that was actually a legitimate place. I never heard anything corrupt about them, but to my disappointment, there weren't too many fantasy video games. Either way, I started to go there. It was quite an adventure to go to that place. It was about a kilometer and a half away from my house. And as kids, well, we didn't have cars, and the adults weren't always able to take us to different places. But in that game, that place, it was basically like a blockbuster. And like I said, they didn't sell RPG books and all of that, but they had fantasy video games. It was very difficult to get some fantasy video games back then. They always had like soccer games and the more mainstream things, like perhaps some Mario games and things like that, or games based on movies. So when we heard that there were fantasy games, the few players that were interested in fantasy, and we had like a small group, but the parents of my friends back then, they didn't want them to play Dungeons and Dragons, so they were also looking for an excuse to rent some fantasy video games, and they could just tell them like, oh, it's just a video game like everyone else plays. It has nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. So we used to go like, we took 3 bikes. We were 4 people with 3 bikes, and we actually had to, like, 3 were riding on the bikes, and the other one was who didn't have a bicycle, just running as best as he could. And we took turns. If that person got too tired, that person got to ride the bicycle, and we kept on going. And it felt like a real adventure, because in Mexico there are some dangerous streets, and sometimes you had to cross through those areas where there were constant fights between gang members and the police against the gangs and all of that. So it felt like an adventure. You're actually going through these dangerous places. When we actually got to MVideos, we made it somewhat of a frequent practice to rent some fantasy video games and play them a bit. Some of them had their instruction manual, some others didn't. But eventually the group also broke up because the parents of one of the members, they discovered that that game was kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, so that video game is belongs to the devil, and you're going to turn into a Satanist if you play it. So then I was on my own going to MVideos. I kind of got like that reputation because I played role-playing games. I was the dungeon master. That he's like the Satanist, the main cult leader or something. So yes, it was very disappointing. But then one time when I went on my own, my mother drove me there. I got to MVideos, and I saw this video game of Drakkhen. I was very disappointed because, like I said, my group had completely dissolved. Not even we didn't even have the chance to play video games together because of the whole Christian panic. So I was looking like for that video game that made me feel as I was part of a group, even although most of the time I was always the dungeon master. The party of adventurers and there was a great distance between us because, like I said, as a dungeon master, you're basically the game world. You're not part of the adventurer group. And so I saw Drakkhen, and I took a look at the box behind, the Super Nintendo box, and it said like, oh, you can control four adventurers in the party and with artificial intelligence. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. I can play as an adventurer, and I have these other members in the party, and it's going to feel as if I am playing with someone. So I rented it immediately. It didn't come with the instruction manual. It was disappointing. They didn't give you the actual manual, but they gave you like photocopies. But you really needed the instruction manual for this role-playing game. So I rented it for a weekend, and I didn't understand anything about it. I kept getting killed. It was in the purest old school style. If you went on your own into dangerous places, you were going to get killed. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a few moments. But, well, like I said, I didn't know how to play it. I didn't understand the combat, which makes me think that a lot of reviewers didn't read the manual at all. So I was very disappointed. I returned it on Sunday or Monday, but there was this small voice inside me telling me, you have to play it again, give it another try, another chance. And a couple of months went by. I went back to MVideo, And then they had like this clearance sale of video games that people were not renting and were, yeah, they were not profitable for the store. And there was Dragon, and they sold it as a used game with the instruction manual included for, it was about $5 or $10. So I immediately took the game, and I spent the entire afternoon that very same day figuring out the instructions. They weren't difficult, but then I started to think about, oh, this is what I did wrong with the game and all of that. So now let me tell you about Dragon. Dragon is a fantasy game that has simple yet complex story. It's not really complex when compared to video games nowadays, but back then video games didn't exactly have the most complex stories. So it's basically that there is this world, the world of Dragon, where the world itself is not called Dragon. I don't remember the name of the world, but it's this world that is kept under a delicate balance. You have elemental dragons that were in charge of keeping the world alive, and they do not explain it quite well, but humans started to wage this war against dragons, and they ended up killing all of the dragons, and because of that the balance of the world was disrupted. Now that I think about it, I wonder if Dark Souls took inspiration from Dragon, because it's somewhat similar, at least when it comes to the whole war against dragons. And so humans were kind of like the villains, and the gods grew quite angry towards the humans, and they created this new species known as the dragon. The dragon are basically half man, half dragon. They're like dragonborn in Dungeons and Dragons. And so the dragon were basically tasked with ruling the entire world, and they were ready to wage war against humans to eradicate humanity. But the gods perhaps felt merciful towards humans, and they gave them a chance. If they could find, I don't remember if they are 4 or 8, but I think they were eight gems that control the elements of the world, like the typical natural elements like fire, water, air, etc. Then if the humans gathered those gems and took them to a certain place, like a sort of monolith or altar, they would restore the balance of the world, and then the dragon wouldn't have to kill them. So my error when I first started to play this game was that I wasn't ready for an old school approach. Like how many modern games, not all of them, but many modern games, they hold your hand the entire time. They are always pointing in the right direction for the next quest. The non-player characters have some sort of mark or exclamation symbol on top of them telling you that you should talk to that character, all of that. But Dragon does not hold your hand. They basically throw you into the game world, and they tell you, oh, the story of the game, and they say, go to the castle of this dragon, and that dragon basically has something important to tell you. And that's it. Nothing else. So anyone who hasn't who hasn't read through the manual, or that simply isn't like adjusted or accustomed to the old style of playing a video game, they had no clue on what to do. But it was quite simple, really. You just had that information. There is a castle and there's a dragon that wants to tell you something. You looked at your map. The map isn't very good, but you kind of see like a small castle, and you head in that direction. A lot of reviewers also thought that you could only control a character in the entire game, and that's actually not true. You can actually swap from the different characters. You could create your own party of adventurers, or you can select the pre-generated characters that have very cliche names. You have like Arthur and Merlin and such. So I created my own party. You have the typical warrior, wizard, a scout, and a cleric. And I basically just entered this castle, I got to the very end of the castle after defeating some enemies. It's somewhat like a maze, and you talk with that dragon. The dragons are quite imposing. They look more like an ogre with a dragon. Even though they are humanoids, they are very tall, quite big. And that's when you start to get the hang of the game. They tell you to go to this place. They tell you, oh, visit this other guy in that place, or retrieve this for me, and all of that. And you get into the flow. But there are so many mysterious things about the game. Well, starting with that it's old school, it's very easy for you to wander into very dangerous areas that are way above your level of experience or power. You can get killed quite easily. In some regions, you encounter this old man that appears out of nowhere. It looks like some sort of wizard or sage, and he tells you something like, your body is not strong to resist the dangers of this area. And in that way, it's not that difficult when compared to other old school RPGs, but you can still wander into very dangerous areas. And for example, you have graves. The entire overworld map looks as a sort of first-person experience. The graphics are quite primitive, of course, but you still manage to see these graves, and if you bump into them, because you know those first-person games, even though you're supposed to feel like you are a person in the very early ones, sometimes they feel a bit like you are in a vehicle. So if you bump into one of those graves, you see this demonic head. It kind of looks like a hellhound, like the one of the heads of Cerberus, and it starts to attack you, and it will probably eliminate you immediately if you first started to play the game. I actually never got to defeat one of those. I usually avoid them all the time. Perhaps later on in the game, after you have leveled up quite a bit and gotten the best, you got your hands on the best weapons and armor, maybe you can take them on. But there are many enemies that just destroy you just like that, and they never tell you like a reason as to why they are there. It makes you wonder in a sort of daydream state as to why that hellhound face or head comes out of the grave to attack you just because you bumped into that gravestone. There are also some very disturbing enemies, and because the music stops playing when you enter battle, battles feel somewhat serious. The sound effects are somewhat disturbing as well. For example, you talk. The soundtrack also includes this sort of weird dialogue, but if you talk with a non-player character, they make this really like a somewhat disturbing song. It goes somewhat like, and it sounds like you're talking to a crazy person or something. And when you fought enemies, they also had some disturbing sound effects. If you attack like lizard men, they had this sound like rack, rack, and like kind of like that. And in some cases, I don't know what exactly triggered that encounter, or if maybe it was completely random. But there was this silhouette. It kind of looked like a version of Slenderman, but as if Slenderman was a shadow person. It looked like this. It kind of looked like an elongated shadow, and that was also a very difficult to kill enemy. It probably it was there was a high chance that it would eliminate the entire party. There were also some moments if you travel during the night and you looked at the night sky, there was this constellation, kind of looked like a flying creature, and suddenly the constellation started to move, very disturbing, very ominous, and then you had to fight a creature made out of that constellation. I always wondered if maybe if you walked into a certain angle and you saw that constellation from the front, maybe that's, well, for a certain angle rather, maybe that's when the creature manifested. So there were all of those very creepy encounters. You never knew what to expect. I think that's quite magical of Drakkhen. Even though the game is quite rudimentary, or you could say primitive compared to games today, the encounters felt, like there was always a surprise. I'm going to put a link in the description below to a video where I talked about random encounters in role-playing games. I also think that Dragon was also one of the things that inspired me when playing different adventures, when running them as a dungeon master or game master later on. Mm, I think my subconscious sometimes used elements of Dragon into those adventures. So yes, it was truly a magical experience. I am going to avoid spoilers in case you want to play Dragon. The Super Nintendo version is somewhat affordable to get. Last time I checked, like $11 or something, or 15, depending on eBay and such. You can also get it very cheap. For example, in Good Old Games, sometimes it's available for $1 or $2. However, the computer version is not as good as the Super Nintendo version because of the music. I was about to purchase the PC version just to have it there in case I wanted to play it again, but then I read that it didn't have the Super Nintendo soundtrack, and that's such a disappointment because the soundtrack is so beautiful, so primitive, yes, yet so beautiful. With the limitations of the system, there are some really amazing and beautiful tracks, most of them. So, well, just before we get into why I love the music so much, I also like it that in the plotline, when you interact with the different dragon, they not all of them want to kill mankind. Some of them are actually allies of humans, but they also conspire against each other. It feels a bit like a draconic Game of Thrones. I'm not going to say which one, but there is actually one of them that you arrive and that dragon has been killed. That dragon, sorry, has been killed and by another dragon. And then you start to feel a bit nervous because you have seen the dragon. They are huge. They are kind of like humanoid dragon ogres of sorts. So you know that it's going to be a very difficult fight. And when you encounter that dead dragon, this very sad music starts to play. How did it go? Like, well, you'll be able to hear it in the soundtrack. But it felt like, oh no, I failed that dragon. Back then, of course, I should have thought that it was all scripted. But because I was so into the story, I felt like I didn't get there in time, and I didn't manage to save that dragon that was actually someone who wanted to protect humanity despite all its flaws. So it felt very sad, and it also like pushed me on to get some revenge or justice for that dragon. Like, I'm going to kill the dragon that killed this one of the few allies of mankind. Okay, now to the music. The music has so much to give in terms of melody. In current times, there are many video games that rely too much, in my opinion, in ambient sound or ambient noise. They are those like music that you simply cannot hum, you cannot whistle that tune. But when it comes to the music of Dragon, just the main theme where when you're moving through the overworld, it sounds so amazing. It really gets you into the mood of just exploring all the world and taking on the different enemies and obtaining some magical items. So amazing. And some music that plays during the night as you are making your way through perhaps a desert or through the mountains and across the lakes, and you hear this music like ta ra 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 ta ra 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 ta ra ra ra. It was beautiful. You really have to listen to the soundtrack. So amazing. That's what I like of the each of the tracks. They express some sort of theme. If you have just arrived to a particular temple or ruins or abandoned site, you hear like this dismal sound that everything is dead or has decayed or is no longer there. It's kind of like dun, 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 like that. It's very ominous, very creepy. And the music changes according to the region. If you enter like a desert area, you hear like these nomadic tunes, like something you would expect to see in a story featuring the Arabian Nights, and there are some songs that feel quite hopeful, some of them very scary, and some of them a bit sad. Mm, there were a few, perhaps a couple of them that felt a bit out of place. There's one like that sounds a bit like some sort of Italian carnival, and there is another one that it just sounds too dynamic, too perhaps too modern. So those songs are actually still great, but they feel a bit out of place. One of them appears in the character creation section. It's too like tin 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 tin, like too upbeat. But the rest of the soundtrack is so beautiful, and there are so many players throughout the years that I have played board games and role playing games with them, and when I put the Dragon soundtrack, they always end up fascinated with the soundtrack. I remember this time we had this player. She had never played role playing games before in her life. In fact, I don't think she had played many games in her life. She seemed a bit like she had a strict upbringing. And when she started to hear this music of Dragon, what song did she hear? Sorry, what? Yes, what was the exact track? I think it was the main theme, like, and she started to listen to it, and she was like, "Wow, what is that? From what game or from what movie?" And she had no idea, because she said the sound is so strange, like so weird. It sounds a bit like Atari, and I told her no, Atari is not as advanced. And I told her this is from a Super Nintendo video game, and she was like, "Oh, that's incredible!" And in another case, I was playing Mage Knight with a player, and I put the Dragon soundtrack, and when it started, he was like, "Oh, that sounds perfect for this game. Oh, where did you get that?" And he was like fascinated, completely, utterly fascinated with the music. No, it's such an amazing soundtrack. I still play it today, depending on the board game as well. Of course, I'm not going to play it when I'm playing a sci-fi game, but for fantasy or science fantasy, it's just perfect. So my highest recommendation that you play the Dragon soundtrack. I'm going to remember the link is in the description below. Play it when you play fantasy board games and video games. Such an amazing soundtrack. So different from so many I guess you could say ruined soundtracks, because there is a very disturbing tendency or trend in current times where they take these fantasy games and they use some music that is completely, it has nothing to do with the game, like those awful Wizards of the Coast commercials featuring Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons and all of that, and they have that music that sounds like it belongs in a basketball game or when you are going clubbing. It has nothing to do with Magic the Gathering or Dungeons and Dragons. And when you compare it to those old commercials, I'm going to put also a link. I'm creating a sort of like a playlist with old Dungeons and Dragons videos. No, I was thinking that I should add a few more, but well, I'm also going to put a link to that trailer or commercial for Chronicles of Mystara. Those of you that haven't played Chronicles of Mystara, it's basically a beat 'em up from Capcom. You know, Capcom from Street Fighter and all of that, Final Fight. It's a beat 'em up, but completely themed around Dungeons and Dragons. It's an official Dungeons and Dragons product. So you have the fighter, the elf, the wizard. That is the old school classes from the first editions. And it's a beat 'em up. You go around fighting against drow, displacer beasts, a beholder. I imagine a beat 'em up where you get to fight against a beholder. Such an amazing game. And the commercial was so, it revived that old magic of role-playing games like Chronicles of Mystara. The announcer has this epic voice, and the soundtrack sounds so magical. For the trailer, the music kind of like, you know, like those magical sounds. I love it when video games go back to those roots. that magical sound that reminds you when you first started to play role-playing games, fantasy board games, war games, and you saw these miniature worlds that serve as gateways to dimensions that only exist in your imagination. So beautiful. So yes, definitely listen to the Drakkhen soundtrack. And if you have some other recommendations about different soundtracks for role-playing games, board games, no matter the theme, right? Maybe you know about some cool retro style music, perfect for Metamorphosis Alpha. Maybe to play. What's the name of that? Gamma World. Maybe it's perfect music for that, for those games. Please let us know in the comments section or make a video response or whatever. I'm always looking forward to know more about different cool sounding music to use in my games. Once again, thank you, and thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending Drive-Thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.